nor me could stand here in this way. So if the floor would be much higher, close to the ceiling, I would have to stand like this. So I would need to adapt to what the floor predisposes me to. And why do I talk about floors? You may say, my God, this guy is crazy. Yeah? No, because our brain's intrinsic activity is like the floor. If it's too high, the stimuli which come from the outside world are processed in a different way. And that exactly seems to be happening in depression. This where it's typical in depression, you have too much apparently activity, which I will show you, and particularly what these patients experience. They have these circulating thoughts, constantly circulating in their own mind, and they cannot stop them. And it's all about their own self. Am I guilty? Am I worthless? And there's no hope for me. So this is thoughts circulating around, and you cannot detach yourself from these thoughts. You are these thoughts, and if you are these thoughts, you feel like it. Depressed, hopeless, frustrated. So the question was for me, what happens if there's such an abnormal focus on the own self, which we introduced in the psychopathology as increased self-focus. Yeah? There's too much focus on the own self, typical symptom of that ruminations. So the question is, how is that related to the brain? And more specifically, you remember that there was a strong overlap between resting state activity and self. So you would assume that these patients' resting state activity is too high. And that's exactly what we found. Just look at these pictures. You see here the healthy subjects. There's high resting state activity in this region here. And that's why when a stimulus is coming, they can only lower their activity to modulate and process that stimulus. If something is too high, it can only go low. That's exactly what happens in these regions. So they show a proper, as we call it, deactivation. And you see the depressed subjects cannot properly deactivate. Why? Because their resting state is already too high. So what you then measure with your scans is decreased amount of deactivation. So that really shows there seems to be abnormally high resting state activity, which seems to correspond to the increased self-focus. We wanted to confirm this finding. So this is very important because there's almost no finding in depression, in particular in schizophrenia, in the biology of these disorders, which has not been contradicted by opposite findings. So you don't really know what is a solid finding. It's like tapping in the dark forest and you look for a path. You just feel everywhere are trees. There's a tree here, there's a tree there, and the sun hasn't raised yet in the morning, and it's completely dark. So this is the situation we are in. But as with every day, the sun comes up, the sun sets, and there's also some hope of light, if some light and hope, if you do proper studies and also ask the questions. We looked into the biochemicals. We looked for particular substances, and one substance you already know. You remember the catatonia and the benzodiazepine and the DORS called GABA. And that seems to be indeed a key also to depression. That the neural activity in the depressed patient seems to be dissociated and decoupled from GABA. There's not enough inhibition. GABA mediates inhibition. And when there's not enough inhibition, of course, the resting state activity becomes abnormally high, in conjunction with abnormal excitation. So it's abnormally coupled to glutamate, another substance which mediates neuronal excitation. So basically, it's very simple. The excitation-inhibition balance is abnormal in depression. And that's why you have this abnormally high resting state activity. And I do not need to say that that in turn might also propel new ideas and new targets for pharmacotherapy as well as psychotherapy. If you consider this in conjunction with the subjective experience. So I want to give you some of my final answers. What finally is the self? So now you said, okay, you went through with me with the mind, you went through a history of philosophy, then it was the mind, then it was the brain, then it was the midline structures, and now suddenly it's GABA and inhibition. So you think, this guy doesn't know what he wants. You're probably right. So then, but again, and now this is the crucial point. I know this is a very strange question, but imagine trying to take the perspective of the brain. Don't take your perspective, but try to take how it is like for the brain. So in the same way, with your spouse, I'm sure you made this often, how is it like for her to be with me? Yeah? I hope the answer is nice. Yeah? So now I do the same for the brain. So how is it like for my brain to constantly encounter all these stimuli and all these many people and colors and what it does and constant input from the brain, from the body. And then also I have to regulate my own intrinsic activity. And I want to be stable. I want to be stable and my intrinsic, my own activity shall flourish. And then there's constantly these perturbations, disruptions from the environment. So what do I do with this input? I inhibit it. I activate my GABA doors and try to keep myself stable and inhibit it. But what does it do? So certain stimuli, as we all know, come through. And so basically our brain is very well able to establish a very selective and adaptive relationship to the environment. We are not aware of that. It constantly goes on. So one of our working hypotheses currently is that indeed this relationship to the environment, and you see it's really biopsychosocial, now strongly depends and is modulated, is gated, if you want to say so, by GABA and neuronal inhibition. And we have strong data supporting this assumption. They are not yet published. So, final question, what is the self? If I tell you that the brain is constantly in exchange with the environment via neuronal inhibition and trying to modulate and adjust its relationship to the environment, and exactly this relationship is yourself. So yourself is intrinsically relational. It cannot escape. It can only shift stronger to the one pole, as in depression when you're completely detached from the environment, or it can shift to the other pole, to the environment, when you feel that you're another person, as in schizophrenia. But our self is always on this continuum between brain/body and environment. So I talk about a relational self. And that corresponds to a certain organization and coding in our brain. And there you again that the self leads me now to a different question yet again, to the question of the neural code. Then you go back again into neuroscience, you don't see much answers to that. That question has not been solved. So we postulate that indeed the question of the self is closely related to the question of the neural code. And now you might say, what then is consciousness? Please tell me what is consciousness. I cannot tell you at this point. I hope I will be able to tell in 10, 20 years. But what I can tell you is that the self is not dependent upon consciousness. So good news for you, even if you sleep or unconscious, yourself is still there. As I said, you do not lose yourself. Yourself is always already there. It has its fingers everywhere. Yeah? So, and this is something we could address experimentally. So what did we do? So we investigated this, is again Dr. Qin from China. He investigated patients in a vegetative state. patients who have, by definition, no consciousness. So, and he stimulated them with their own name. So this was really a very good idea he had. So he stimulated them with their own name, and what he could detect, a lot of activity in these patients' brain. So basically, your brain still reacts to personally relevant stimuli as your own name, whether there's consciousness or not. And that tells me that the self is prior to consciousness. And that may sound for you very evident. For a philosopher, it's groundbreaking, because for a philosopher, the self was always related with self-consciousness. I think, therefore I am. I become aware of myself, and this awareness is myself. Self-reflection, self-awareness, self-consciousness. But here you suddenly see maybe the self and consciousness are decoupled from each other. So yourself may be a very basic thing. The base is like the floor we always stand on, and we are usually not aware of. That we become only aware of when it's abnormally changed, as in depression or schizophrenia. So I do find the brain a wonderful organ. And I do not find it very gruesome. As some people would say, is our self nothing but the brain? But that is very gruesome. I would say not. But also our brain is not just pure gray pulp. And our self is not pure gray pulp. The brain is much more. It applies a certain coding upon all stimuli coming from the environment via inhibition and coding. And that relationship between brain and environment, I think we need to understand in order to understand self, consciousness, and the nature of depression and schizophrenia and other psychiatric disorders. So for me, the brain is not gruesome. Instead, it does something relating us continuously to the environment. Our brain-based self may not have the full capacity to understand. Thank you very much.